Malcolm, thank you very much for your words of welcome. And I'm delighted to be here, and indeed I'm privileged to be here. Unlike most of you, I'm not a safety professional. I recall that when in 1986 I left the practice of the law for the bench, a senior judge who was retiring at that time used a gardening metaphor to describe the change from the bar to the bench. He said it was good for lawyers to be repotted from time to time. Well, to continue the metaphor, a few years later, I find myself being transplanted to the very different medium of a public inquiry, and indeed in this very building. Today I'm going to give you some reflections on a number of issues in the Piper inquiry and look at them in the light of later events and developments. But first, it might be of interest if I say briefly how I approached the task of thinking about the future of safety offshore. What was I to investigate? In the second part of my remit, I was asked to make, and I quote, and you'll see it on the screen, observations and recommendations with a view to the preservation of life and the avoidance of similar accidents in the future. I asked myself, which subjects should I investigate and how far should I pursue them? And what about the words similar accidents? Major accidents may involve catastrophic consequences, but such particular accidents are relatively rare. History does not repeat itself in exactly the same fashion. So it didn't make sense to take a narrow view of the implications of the disaster for the future of offshore safety. I was also very conscious of the deadly and profound effect of the disaster. The unthinkable had happened, and a tremendous shock had run through the industry. The government had announced that the inquiry should be as full and far-reaching as necessary. This was the first statutory inquiry under the regulations of 1974. The last inquiry, not under statute but a non-statutory one, had been concerned with the collapse and sinking of a self-elevating barge, the Sea Gem, outside the mouth of the River Humber in 1965. It was obvious that much had happened since that time. At that time, there had been recommendations about matters such as discipline, a chain of command, the keeping of logbooks, and the equivalent of a shipmaster's daily round. So, I took a fairly broad approach, and with the assistance of my excellent assessors, Professor Frank Lees, Malcolm Ford, and Brian Appleton, I examined the significance of whatever had a tenable connection with the chain of events which led up to the full catastrophe. I also took account of other factors which in the event played no part in bringing about the result, but were in themselves cause for concern. Before taking on a subject with a view to making observations or recommendations, I satisfied myself it was feasible for a public inquiry to handle those issues. I had to be careful about extrapolating from Piper Alpha, but it had the benefit of evidence as to good practice across the North Sea. Before I got to grips with the inquiry, I imagined it would be concerned with hardware. Well, to some extent it was. Take, for instance, subsea isolation valves, lacking in the case of Piper Alpha. But I quickly realized that fundamental and running through everything was the management of safety. And as I dug down into the background of what happened, I discovered it was not just a matter of technical or human failure. As is often the case, such failures are indicators of underlying weaknesses in the management of safety. In the case of Piper Alpha, management shortcomings emerged in a variety of forms. For example, there was no clear procedure for shift handovers. The permit to work system was inadequate, but so far as it went, it had been habitually and frequently departed from. Training, monitoring, and auditing had been poor, and the lessons of a previous relevant accident had not been followed through. Evacuation procedures had not been practiced adequately, and there had not been an adequate assessment of the potential major hazards or measures for controlling them. A glaring example was the risk of a high-pressure gas fire. The consequences would be grave for the structural integrity of the platform, for the safety of personnel, and for the means of evacuation and escape. The gas pipelines would take hours to depressurize, and this, of course, became a dreadful reality on the night of the disaster. So these and other examples provided in due course possible starting points for considering recommendations to the industry and for changes to the regulation of safety. As matters turned out, I found myself considering the whole legal framework in which operators have to work and with which they have to comply. At the same time, I was conscious, as I said in my report, that no amount of regulations for safety improvements can make up for deficiencies in the way in which safety is actually managed. The quality of management of safety is fundamental, and that quality depends critically, in my view, on effective safety leadership at all levels and the commitment of the whole workforce to give priority to safety. I saw those factors as intertwined with each other and together making for a positive learning culture and all that that entails in the way of values, attitudes, and practices. On leadership, I said this: it is essential to create a corporate atmosphere or culture in which safety is understood to be and is accepted as the number one priority. Management have to communicate the safety philosophy at all times and at all levels within the organization, but most particularly by their everyday decisions and actions in tackling the many issues that arise in operating in the North Sea. They provide the opportunity for subordinates to see real practical substance being put to the safety policy and for exploring the soundness of the safety policy against the realities of operating. End of quotation. Leaders undoubtedly set the tone. A member of the board which investigated the loss of the space shuttle Columbia and its crew in 2003 later wrote this: leaders must remember that what they emphasize can change an organization's stated goals and objectives. If reliability and safety are preached as organizational bumper stickers, but leaders constantly emphasize keeping on schedule and saving money, workers will soon realize what is deemed important and change accordingly. He also offered a number of one-line pieces of advice. He was, in fact, I think, a brigadier general, and the article he wrote is full of these one-liners. One is, be thorough and inquisitive. Avoid leadership by PowerPoint. Another one was, question untested assumptions. Now, as to commitment, I said in my report, it is essential the whole workforce is committed to and involved in safe operations. The first-line supervisors are a key link to achieving that, as each is personally responsible for ensuring that all employees, whether the company's own or contractors, are trained to and do work safely, and that they not only know how to perform their jobs safely, but are convinced that they have a responsibility to do so. By the time of my report in 1990, safety committees incorporating elected representatives were already at work under the 1989 regulations. Safety representatives are not, of course, part of the management of installations, but they have a number of important safety functions, such as investigating potential hazards and dangerous incidents, which are backed up by the power to carry out inspections and communicating safety concerns to management. And of course, that means doing so without fear of recrimination. I saw that system, in my own words, as providing an opportunity for new ideas and new solutions to safety problems to be brought up, and a means of passing verbatim and uncensored safety comments up the management line. It also helps reinforce the principle that each employee is responsible for his own safety and that of his fellow workers. Under the 1989 regulations, the employer of safety representatives has a duty to provide them with training. That training is somewhat cryptically expressed. I quote, "Such training in aspects of the functions of a safety representative as may be reasonable in all the circumstances." The kind of words only a lawyer would use. In practice, it seems this meant basic training in the law of health and safety, workplace hazards, and measures to reduce them, and the employer's health and safety policy, and instructions as to how safety representatives should carry out their functions. Recently, I understand, there have been some developments. Following pilot courses earlier this year, there is now, I think, a new OPITO-approved standard for additional development training of safety representatives. The courses include investigating incidents and applying root cause analysis and the effective use of inspections and audits. I strongly commend the initiative that led to this development. Who would disagree with one of the observations in the report of the independent review under Professor Geoffrey Maitland in 2011, and it was this, that representatives will be more effective if they have a good understanding of the major process hazards in an organization's activities and how the risks are managed. Training in this respect would impart the ability, knowledge and understanding necessary to make them more competent in this area. Included in this must be the ability to communicate effectively with workforce and managers alike. There are, of course, many ways in which leadership in safety has to be exercised and many ways in which a good culture has to be expressed. What I'm going to do now is to take Piper Alpha as my starting point and use it and some more recent major accidents as illustrations and pick out a number of themes. As you will see, though there are 4 in number, they are all very closely related. And the first, an obvious one, I suppose, is process safety. The shortcomings on Piper, which I mentioned, represented failures on the part of the management to give adequate attention to process safety. That's to say, safety from major hazards, where the frequency of realization is low, but the potential consequence is very serious. Later accidents elsewhere in the world provide further examples, beginning with the onshore industry. In 2005, an overflow of petrol at the oil storage depot at Buncefield in England led to the ignition of a vapor cloud and a massive explosion and fire. A monitoring gauge had been sticking for months without an effective response, and a high-level switch for closing down the flow was inoperable, and due to a lack of communication, it had not been locked in a working position. And bunds for containing fuel were inadequately designed and maintained. A report by the Strategic Management Group of the Competent Authority, published later in 2011, stated that various pressures had created a culture where keeping the process operating was the primary focus, and process safety did not get the attention, resources, or priority that it required. The safety management system focused too closely on personal safety and lacked any real depth about the control of major hazards. There should have been a clear understanding of major accident risks and the safety critical equipment and systems designed to control them. At the core of managing a major hazard business, there should be a clear and positive process safety leadership with board level involvement and competence to ensure that major hazard risks were being properly managed. In that same year, 2005, as you'll recall, BP's Texas City refinery was the subject of a disaster, a release of flammable liquid, an explosion and fire. The United States Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board stated it was caused by organizational and safety deficiencies at all levels of the corporation, cost-cutting, failure to invest, and production pressures had impaired process safety performance. Reliance on a low personal injury rate as a safety indicator had failed to provide a true picture of process safety performance and the health of the safety culture. That disaster led to a setting up of a panel under James Baker III, former United States Secretary of State, which investigated the culture and management systems at BP's United States refineries. In the words of its report, BP emphasized personal safety but not process safety and did not set an appropriate process safety tone at the top or establish appropriate goals and expectations regarding process safety performance. 5 years later came Macondo. Among the many words that have been written on this disaster was a report by the Deepwater Horizon Study Group by members of the Center for Catastrophic Risk Management. Their findings were strikingly similar. They said, for example, BP's organizations and operating teams did not possess a functional safety culture. Their system was not propelled towards the goal of maximum safety in all of its manifestations, but was rather geared towards a trip and fall compliance mentality rather than being focused on the big picture. It has been observed that BP's system forgot to be afraid. Next topic, learning. Management, of course, have a responsibility to check constantly to make sure that their arrangements for the control of risk are working properly and to improve them in the light of experience, including, as ever, human factors, and also the light of developments in practice and technology. It goes almost without saying that auditing is essential. As far as I'm concerned, it should be inquisitive auditing. On Piper, there had been an audit of the permit to work procedure 6 months before the disaster. No deficiencies had been reported. Senior management assumed that in the absence of such feedback, all was well, but the practice was actually very different. Along with auditing is the need to see that lessons from accidents, incidents are learnt and communicated. If you read the account of a major accident, you will often find that it was preceded by the neglect of signs which warned that all was not well. 9 months before the Piper Alpha disaster, a rigger had been killed in an accident which had been due to the members of the night shift improvising in the course of a lifting job without an additional permit to work, and to their not receiving adequate information from the day shift. After that incident, management took some steps, but they were not followed through, and there was no lasting effect on practice. I recall a chief process engineer from Piper saying in the course of his evidence, there was always times when it was a surprise when you found out some things were going on. I quote. In the case of Buncefield, there had been clear signs that the equipment was not fit for purpose, but no one questioned why or what should be done other than carrying out a series of temporary fixes. Warning signs of a possible disaster had been present at the Texas City refinery, for several years, but the company officials had not intervened effectively. The Maitland Review rightly drew attention to this need, and I quote, continually to search existing risk control systems for signals of potential failure and incident precursors, sometimes rather subtle or weak, which warn of problems but do not themselves escalate into major incidents, unquote. Next, the topic of communicating. The need for communication can be illustrated in so many different ways. Everything from shift handovers, as in the case of Piper Alpha, to spreading the word and example of safety policy and practice. The panel and James Baker said, in order to ensure that corporate level managers and the United States refinery workforce develop a shared value on the importance of process safety, BP's corporate management must clearly, frequently, and consistently communicate that value. During its review, the panel found little to indicate that before March 2005, BP corporate management had effectively demonstrated its commitment to process safety either through its communications or through a regular presence at US refineries. Communication is no doubt especially demanding in the offshore industry. For example, it is normal that different workforces have to work together, and they're doing so in an isolated and demanding environment. The commission, which investigated the blowout at the Montara wellhead platform in 2009 in the Timor Sea, found that a contributive factor had been a systemic failure of communication between the owners and the rig operators, and between rig and onshore personnel of both companies. The rig operators were ultimately responsible for rig safety, but when it came to certain critical procedures, it was the owners who were calling the shots. Rig personnel had been oblivious to key and flawed decisions taken by the owners or had simply gone along with them. The Commission observed that the relationship between the owners and the rig operators needed to be more formalized, with mutual explicit sign-off on important decisions affecting safety, well integrity, and the environment. 8 months later, we come to Macondo again, where the National Commission observed later BP and other operators must have effective systems in place for integrating the various corporate cultures, internal procedures, and decision-making protocols of the many different contractors involved in drilling a deep water well. And fourthly, turning aspirations into reality. Many companies have emphatic safety slogans such as absolute safety or zero accidents. Piper was no exception, but what happens in practice, because sometimes the banner headlines conceal weaknesses. At the time of the major accident, rail accident at Clapham Junction in 1988, British Rail had a policy of, quote, absolute safety, unquote. The author of an official report on the accident said the appearance was not the reality. The concern for safety was permitted to coexist with working practices which were positively dangerous. This unhappy coexistence was never detected, and so bad practices were never eradicated. The best of intentions regarding safe working practices was permitted to go in hand with the worst of inaction in ensuring that such practices were put into effect. The Baker panel said BP has the aspirational goal that there be no accident, no harm to people. But it appears that refinery managers have not received effective operational guidance from corporate level refining management as to how to achieve that goal. BP appears to have had a corporate blind spot relating to process safety. I'm going to turn now to one aspect of the regulation of safety namely the requirement for safety cases. And I do so because of their intimate connection with the management of safety. Safety cases had been required for onshore installations for whether major hazards for some time, ever since the introduction of the SEMA regulations in the aftermath of the Flixborough disaster in 1974. As I said in my report, it was a serious setback for the development of the offshore safety regime that in 1987 the Department of Energy had advised against such legislation being extended offshore. Onshore, the hazards were serious enough. Offshore, they were compounded by the isolation of the installations, the concentration of the workforce on or near them, the unpredictability of the weather, and the fact that in the event of an emergency, immediate protection for the workforce had to be provided. Moreover, safety was complicated by the fact that conduct of one set of employees might affect that of others. These and other considerations led me to the view that there was a need for offshore safety cases covering not only the identification and control of potential hazards, but also temporary protection and safe and full evacuation, escape and rescue, and the operators' safety management systems. I said that the quality of safety management was an imperative component of the regulatory regime. Further, the safety case should include provision as to how safety should be achieved by the involvement in safety of the workforce, both the operators and the contractors. Now, the requirement for safety cases is no doubt demanding for operators and demanding for those who have to discharge a regulatory function. It calls for expertise, vigilance, and resources. They mean, of course, a thorough assessment of risk, however that risk may come to be realized, asking and answering the what-if questions, and avoiding making do with preconceptions. I hope I will not be thought to be trying to steal the thunder of Sir Charles Haddon Cave, who is speaking tomorrow, if I quote from his review of the Nimrod crash for an example of a miserable failure of a safety case. He said that the Ministry of Defence safety case for the Nimrod was a lamentable job from start to finish, riddled with errors, missing the key dangers. Its production was a story of incompetence, complacency, and cynicism. It was fatally undermined by a flawed assumption. The exercise was seen as merely one of proving something which everyone already knew as a fact, that Nimrod was safe. This attitude was corrosive and served to undermine the integrity of the whole process. Now, as regards the production of safety cases, I said this: a company which is competent to operate an offshore installation should be competent to produce a safety case. Moreover, involvement of the company's own personnel is the best way to obtain the full benefit within the company and for the purpose of dialogue with the regulators. On the other hand, consultants have a role in bringing an independent perspective and assisting with novel and specialist techniques. I would draw particular attention to my words, involvement of the company's own personnel. It follows from the involvement of personnel in the success of the management of safety that they should be in a position to contribute to the production, review, and revision of safety cases. The safety case regulations of 1992 introduced the right of safety representatives to have access to the safety case in a number of ways, and the duty of duty holders to consult them in good time with regard to the preparation of the safety case. In due course, the safety case regulations of 2005 require that the safety case should include information as to how the elected safety representatives were consulted with regard to its revision, review, or preparation. I note that the guide to those regulations states that the duty holder should keep representatives informed as to the outcome of such discussions, and that matters to do with the safety case should be a standing item for safety committee meetings. This is very much in line with what I had in mind. And the OPITO courses to which I referred earlier also include understanding and identifying major accident hazards and understanding risk analysis for the purposes of preparing or revising safety cases. Some might be tempted to think that the preparation or revision of a safety case could be little more than a paper exercise to satisfy the regulatory body. To my mind, that would be to misunderstand its purpose and value. For management, the exercise of focusing on safety in a systematic way may reveal unforeseen scenarios or gaps in essential protection. It provides a learning opportunity. Furthermore, the value of a safety case should be fulfilled by its use. It should represent the current management of safety on the installation and thus take account of any significant changes. It can enable senior management to communicate their safety strategy. It should assist the workforce to understand the rationale for current systems and practices, and it should assist in decision-making and facilitate improvements in safety. Now, of course, this presupposes that those who should have the information from the safety case can find it and can understand it. This is surely consistent with the need for consultation to which I have referred. However, as I understand it, the typical safety case is extensive, and due to the need for it to be technically robust, much of it may be relatively complex. That is indeed a problem. The safety review carried out by the Maitland panel said in its report that safety cases, and I quote, should be living documents central to the way facilities are operated and with contents widely understood by senior managers and workforce alike. Any organization that regards them simply as a regulatory necessity denies itself the opportunity of realizing the value they can aid to their business. Now, that is a real challenge. It's another test for the quality of the management of safety. A safety case should reflect the organization's safety culture. If that culture is sound and healthy, it should show. Thank you.
Thank you so much.